This video is the third in the series on the book Chess Strategy Move by Move by the author Adam Hunt. It will be on development in the opening and early middle game, beginning by showing how to create and take advantage of a lead in development, then showing an example of some more atypical development in a closed position, before ending by showing ways in which you can disrupt your opponent's development. This first game in the Danish Gambit will show how important open lines and development are, even at the cost of material. We can see here early in the game that white is giving up one pawn, and then gives up yet another pawn on b2, so that both of the bishops and the queen can have fully open lines. After black plays queen g5, white does something important that we'll see later in this video as well, developing with tempo. Knight f3 attacks the queen, forcing black to respond to it. Black grabs the pawn and white plays another move with tempo, attacking the queen. And after black plays this bishop check, white plays this strange looking move, king e2, however it's quite logical. If white had instead played knight bd2, there would have been some slightly loose pieces on the king side and some awkward development later on. If knight c3, then the dark squared bishop is blocked, and if bishop c3, then you're just giving up your strong dark squared bishop that you gave up a pawn to have on the long diagonal. On the other hand, with king e2, both bishops are alive, and white has a lot of open lines to attack the black position. After queen h3, there's this shot bishop takes f7, making use of the fact that knight g5 would be a fork on the king and queen. Going forward just a few moves, we can see the black position just collapsing, and after knight g5, there's this nice shot, knight to e6, checkmate, taking advantage of the queen on the d file, pinning the d pawn. This game clearly shows how by giving up some material you can guarantee your pieces some open lines, and this move king e2 also very instructive, showing how even though the king looks like it could be unsafe, because of the lead in development that white has, it's really irrelevant. Importantly, white also developed with some tempo. We can see here knight f3 attacking the queen, rook g1 attacking the queen, really just moves that create threats and force black to respond. This next game will show how to make use of a development advantage, starting with this position with the move knight to e2, where white tries to prevent black from doubling his queenside pawns, but in doing so blocks the bishop and thus delays castling. A few moves later we reach this position, where black plays this important move d4, trying to crack open the position while white's king is still in the center. After e takes d4, we can see this e-file opening up, which black makes use of with rook to e8 check. After white plays knight to e2, again blocking in the bishop, we see queen b6, developing with tempo, attacking both the b2 and d4 pawns. White decides to defend the d4 pawn, and so black takes here. And here, white tries to trade off queens by playing this important move queen c1. However, if we look at the two queens, we can see that black's is very active, whereas white's still on the first rank is not active at all, and so it would be a very unwise decision to trade right here, and so black dodges by playing queen to b5. White again tries to initiate a trade, however black sidesteps this by playing queen a5, again creating a threat on the c3 pawn, taking advantage of the pin along the e-file. As a side note, better for white instead of queen b1 was actually f3, trying to get the king out of the way of the pin and move to a safer square. Now after queen a5, white plays king d1, now losing castling rights but trying to get out of the pins. Black continues to play actively by playing bishop to f5, attacking the queen, with an important note that if queen takes b7, there's queen a4 check, there's rook a b8, and the queen's coming in. All of black's pieces are getting very active and white is dead lost in this position. So instead of taking, white plays queen to b3, however this position is already very dire. Black plays rook to d8, completing development. White plays king to c1 to try and get off the file of the rook, however there's this nice tactical shot, knight takes d4, opening things up even further. And after a nice tactical sequence, we can see the white king is driven to the corner, and this eventually leads to checkmate. The important points in this game were in this position, where black made the decision to play d4, opening up the position while the white king was still in the center, and the points where black developed with tempo, such as with queen b6, attacking the b2 and d4 pawns, and with queen a5, attacking the c3 pawn, and in general, preventing white from getting any counterplay. In some positions, especially closed ones, it can be difficult to develop naturally and activate your pieces. In this game, we'll see how even if your development isn't typical, it can still be effective. Here we see a French winnower, where the position gets closed fairly early on, and we see this interesting move h4, not a developing move, but it's fine since the center is closed and it can help facilitate a kingside attack later on. A few moves later, we can see white pressing forward with h5, and here black plays h6. Now you might wonder why not c takes d4, winning a pawn. However, here white just develops, and after d takes c3, bishop takes c3, it seems like black is just up a pawn. However, if we look a few moves later, we can see that black isn't really that developed. White has a significant space advantage and much more active pieces. So instead, there's this h6 move. After a couple more developing moves, it's hard to see how white continues to develop their pieces. However, there's this interesting move, rook to h4. The rook is deployed up the h-file and looks to move to g4 or to f4 and pressure the king side. Alternatively, if we tried to develop the rook the natural way, by developing the bishop, then castling, then maybe moving the rook to the e-file and rook lifting, that would have taken a significantly longer time. Black plays c4 to close the fourth rank, and after rook to f4, we can see some pressures being put on the f7 square. After black plays bishop to d7, we can see how black might want to castle queenside, however this f7 pawn would fall. Here, white plays another strange looking move, knight to h4, looking to bring the queen into g4 and put more pressure on black's kingside, which is slightly weak. White might be tempted here to play bishop e2, something that looks like a developing move. However, if we really are thinking critically, we can see that the bishop isn't really doing much more on e2 than it was on f1, so there's no reason to waste time here fake developing the bishop. After knight h4, black is prompted to make some weaknesses on the king side, which can now be exploited by the queen and the rook and the knight. Speaking through this section a little bit, we can see how white pressures and then just simply wins these weaknesses on the king side and is now just up material. A few moves later, we can see how the bishop being on f1 is actually helpful, since rook h1 doesn't come with check, and that no longer needs to be factored into the calculations. And lastly, white plays this move king to d2, taking advantage of the fact that the center is closed to walk the king further forward, defending the c2 pawn so now the queen can move out of the way, and getting off the back rank and the annoying pin. White is just a clean 2 pawns up, and the game proceeds smoothly from here. The important points in this game were really this rook h4 move, an atypical type of development that proved to be very effective in pressuring black's kingside, and later making sure not to play this bishop e2 move, which may look nice, but in practical terms it's not a helpful move. These final two examples will focus on playing moves that hinder your opponent's development. This first example is a common idea that you can find in the Caro-Kann, using this kind of sketchy line for white. After h5, there's this nice move e6, where after f takes e6, we can see that the e pawn and the g pawn can't move, freezing this dark squared bishop of black's on f8. White plays this move bishop to d3, trying to trade off black's only developed piece and potentially exploit the weaknesses on the king side. After bishop f7 declining that trade, there's this important move g5, stopping the knight on that king side from developing to f6 or to h6, and currently threatening to play g6 and trap the bishop, forcing black to play yet another move that's not a developing move. After knight e2, we can see how white has easy development, however black is very cramped, a lot of the pieces on the king side cannot move at all, and the queen side development is a little bit more awkward for black than it is for white. And in this final example, black here is having some difficulty coming up with a plan of his own, so what they decide to do is to trade on d4 and play this important move bishop to a4. This prevents white from bringing a rook to the d1 square, and also prevents the queen from swinging over to b3 and pushing the queenside pawns. Importantly, white doesn't have this resource of bishop to d1, since after bishop takes d1, rook takes d1, there's this move queen takes c4, winning a pawn. So, after this move bishop to a4, white plays queen to e3, preventing black from playing rook to d8 by now having this bishop to b6 move, skewering the queen to the rook. Both sides are very aware of their opponent's avenues for counterplay and activity, and are thus preventing them before they can even happen. Because of this, neither side can really get anything going, and the game soon ended in a draw. And with that game, we've reached the end of the chapter and of the video. First, we looked at ways in which you can use a lead in development to quickly run over your opponent. Then, we saw an example of how atypical development can be very effective, and how sometimes moves that look like development aren't helpful. And lastly, we saw how it can be very useful to identify your opponent's ways of developing their pieces and take time to prevent them. All of the games and positions featured in this video are in a study that is linked in the description, and subscribe to know when the next video comes out.